to do with taking community members or community leaders from Iowa back to, in this case, Mexico, to the home community where many of the people from that town had immigrated from, so that you could get a better understanding of where these people come from.
Yes, in that particular chapter we talked about the groups that we took from Marshalltown. I think over the years we probably took 75 people from Marshalltown to Michoacan. They started taking people from other places like Storm Lake and Perry, and other places to actually visit other kinds of communities, other Sydney communities, and places like Jalisco and others. And for the most part, it was largely effective. And yes, it has been duplicated by a handful of other institutions. The problem is it became very expensive, and now it's actually become very dangerous as well. But I would say that for the most part, probably 98% of the people I took actually got it. You're always going to take, go back to my highly scientific term, knuckleheads. You're always going to end up with a couple knuckleheads, and they just don't get it. But for the most part, it was actually fairly effective. I wouldn't do it now on a bet. I did it for about 8 years and took probably 200 people from Mexico. But right now, I wouldn't drive a van full of white people from Michoacan for all the money in the world. That's an honest answer.
Yes.
Could all of you talk about sort of the economic effects of immigration in Iowa, and not only the job market, but on the schools and taxes and things like that?
The question had to do with the economic effects of immigration on Iowa, schools, jobs, and sort of across the board.
Professor Gray.
Well, with regard to health, the picture is quite mixed. People frequently like to say people are only coming here because they want our health care, and no truer or bigger lie can be put out there. By and large, people who make it up here are extremely resilient and basically very healthy and strong people, and they are not coming for our health care. They are coming, as Dr. Gray said, to work for the most part. And in fact, occasionally people do access the health care, but by and large they're charged out of pocket, and so they're actually quite loath to approach the healthcare system. And in fact, it's so draconian at times for people who are not white Iowa-born people that even people who have rights to access healthcare do not do it because they're afraid of prejudicial or racist kinds of responses or police responses. And so, at least from the healthcare perspective, it's fairly clear that they are not costing our economy, but rather are contributing because they pay taxes and they contribute to our Medicare system, and they contribute to Social Security, but oftentimes they will never be able to access those funds. So this is a positive for Iowa when they're working here.
About 3 weeks ago, I got my first hate email, and the person said that, who was I to be advocating just to be bringing in Mexicans into the United States to take our American money and take away our American jobs, and that he was really upset, and that he said that I should go to a certain place. And then also, you're probably not legally here in the United States either. And so I responded with a couple things. I said, first of all, you're knocking on the wrong door. Second of all, the people that you're talking about are here working and contributing to society, and the place where you are sending me to, I just wanted to know if I needed to be documented for that place. And then I said, well, I'd probably run into you. Anyway, but the other thing, much of this is anecdotal in terms of telling the story. Telling the story of the American dream. It's anecdotal, and the more you become familiar with people who are here in the United States and are not documented, the more you begin to see that this is really just another part of the American dream. I worked in Columbus Junction back 20 years ago. I'd drive up from Muscatine to say Mass at 5 o'clock on Saturday in Columbus Junction. I had 15 people at Mass. If I would do the same thing today, I would have 250 people at Mass. The demographics of Columbus Junction has changed. Storefronts that were closed are now open. Businesses that were closed are now open. The local guy at the gas station is making money because people are buying gas. Why? Because they need to get to work. People are renting homes and apartment buildings because the economy is being revitalized through immigration. You know, does that, and when it comes to the American dollar, you know, the only color that is seen in the American dollar is green, although it's changing now. I think there's a little tint into mixture. So a lot of it is anecdotal, and the more we hear about people's stories and realize that we're human beings, the better off we're going to be.
Jeff, could you talk about some of the challenges?
Yeah. You know, and I would say, to echo something, you know, when I see new businesses opening up in our community, you know, a lot of them are being opened up and started by recent arrivals to the community. That's where a lot of the economic entrepreneurial action's coming from. It's not folks who've been in the community for a long time. They're taking jobs at the University of Iowa. You know, they're leaving the state. It's, you know, people who are arriving. They're arriving and they need something to do, and they're a big engine, economic engine in our community. You mentioned school districts too, and I'm not a part of the school district, but the school district in our community, there's a lot of debate going on right now because there's been some huge cuts. We've had, and we're graduating our first seniors from this program, but West Liberty has a dual language program. And at least through 6th grade currently, students will get half of their instruction in Spanish and half of it in English. Fabulous program. My daughter's in it. I think it's great. I think it's terrific. I love the idea that she's going to grow up at least somewhat fluent in Spanish, because it's a lot easier to learn when you're that little and hearing it every day. But with school cuts, you know, there's a perception in the community and a lot of people saying, well, you know, if you just got rid of that dual language program, then, you know, we could focus on, you know, your basic reading, writing, arithmetic. And, you know, I kind of counter to people. I say, you know, walk into those classrooms. It's not, you know, we're not having those classes because, you know, families where Spanish is the primary language spoken in the home don't want to learn English. Those classes are mostly full of kids like mine. That, you know, the parents feel like it's important that their child learns Spanish. So, you know, some people kind of talk about how you know, trying to address non-native, the ESL students, you know, as being a big drain on the school district. You know, I don't think that's the case at all, and it's in fact quite been a positive, because the dual language program was in part a response to that, and just had a benefit that no one was really thinking of it at the time. People actually moved to West Liberty to get their kids into that program. So, you know, I guess if you're talking about economic impact, that's a huge one. You know, there's a reason, you know, our home prices, you know, for a town of 3,300, I mean, part of the reason we have good home prices is our proximity between Iowa City and Muscatine, but part of it is people want to move there. So, you know, I think, you know, having that influx of recent arrivals has been, from an economic standpoint, very positive for our community. So,
I'm going to push you a little bit, though. I mean, it's not all easy, and it's not all positive. I mean, there are challenges, there are costs to having new immigrants in any community, any place in the country. What are you seeing, Mark, in different, or Chad, if you want to, what are you seeing as some of, again, not that it's balanced out by something else, but what are you seeing as sort of the costs and the challenges?
I think probably one of the, I mean, if you want to talk about a cost, and we're kind of going through this as a city right now, is translating things. I mean, you can't, although some people will try, just pull anybody off the street and say, you know, oh, you speak Spanish, why don't you translate this for me? You know, it's a much more technical thing than that, and our school district hires a full-time employee to do that. They're actually going to cut that down to half-time as part of the budget response. The city doesn't have anyone formally designated And there's a lot of give and take about whether we should be doing that and whether we should be translating things. You know, I look at it as you know, most fairly unique for a community. 92% of our budget comes from utilities. We operate our own electric utility. You know, I tell people, you know, because I'll hear it sometimes, well, you know, they can't vote, they don't participate in the city, why are we even bothering to translate this? And I say, you know what, they're utility customers. If nothing else, you know, it's customer service. You know, name me another company that, you know, probably half of their users, you know, either speak some Spanish in the home, that wouldn't go that extra mile to try and satisfy their customers. So, I mean, that's certainly an expense in doing that. I know our school district and the city itself, you know, we pay a premium to try and attract folks who do speak two languages to accommodate those needs. So, you know, there are some expenses, but you know, I for the most part, that fits it. Go.
Marque dos para español. Press 2 for Spanish.
Very briefly, yeah, interpretation does cost, translation does cost. And what's been very interesting over the last 15 years or so, we've seen a growing number of larger institutions like larger school districts, hospitals, law enforcement actually engage full-time or even part-time professional interpreters. That's been wonderful. Most of it's been in Spanish. As I mentioned, we have this tremendous proliferation of other languages now. And so, and what we're finding ourselves doing is doing a lot of training on just using a graphic sign language, using language lines. So you may be familiar, there's a telephone service that provides something like 180 different languages, which works in an emergency. And the law enforcement use it, the people in emergency rooms use it. Sometimes school districts use it during parent-teacher conferences. It works very well, so if they know somebody's going to come in ahead of time who speaks Urdu, then they can set up that service. Problem is it is expensive, and we do try as much as possible to help people figure out ways, at least in an emergency, how to communicate as effectively as possible without having to rely upon those relatively expensive means. But it is an expense, yes.
Yes. Could there be reverse discrimination in people who don't speak dual languages, for example, wanted to move to West Liberty and get a job?
I wouldn't say it's progressed to that point yet. I think most of the larger institutions that do a lot of business with Hispanics who Spanish is their primary language will try and hire one or two folks. You know, I'll go into the bank sometimes and see a fairly long line of people waiting for that one individual that speaks fluent Spanish to help them with their transactions. So I mean, it's not an across the board wholesale, I think, buy-in for the businesses in the community. I think there's a recognition that they have to try and provide something to do that. Quite honestly, most of the translation that happens, and I see it in my law practice too, is you know, I'll get an adult who comes in with their 14-year-old who was born here in the U.S. and you know, they speak some Spanish, but they're because it's spoken in the home, but English is really the language they use, and those kids are providing, you know, a very large bulk amount of the translation. I would imagine you see that quite a bit too. So, you know, that's sort of the gap that fills in is the parents, or for the parents.
Yes. What to do with the legislative legal climate that might allow undocumented students to be able to come to the University of Iowa?
I can do it.
Okay.
The current state is, for the Regents institutions, it's a de facto don't ask, don't tell. Admission without a social security number is possible, but then you run into the problem of how you pay for it. And that ultimately is the difficulty that we find ourselves in today, is that we actually have we have growing numbers of high school graduates who are first and second generation Latino, perfectly able to go to university or to a college, might be admitted, but because their parents may be undocumented, they can't afford to pay for it. So what we're starting to see in places like Juarez and Storm Lake and others, frankly, just kind of kids when they're 13, 14, look down the road, and they go, yeah, I'm perfectly smart enough. My English is perfect. I can finish high school. I'm smart enough to go to Iowa or UNI or whatever, but I can't get financial aid, so what's the point? So they drop out, buy fake papers, and go cut up pigs for $13 an hour up at Tyson. So we set them up to fail, basically. And the DREAM Act, which has been introduced at the state and federal level, would allow those students to not only finish high school, but actually gain admission to universities and colleges, but most importantly, access financial aid. And so I hope and pray that we actually do have meaningful immigration reform, that the DREAM Act is a very big part of that. And I'm reasonably, I'm an optimist anyway, but I'm reasonably optimistic that we have a fighting chance for that.
One of the big things that influenced our policy, both on the national level and the state level, was 9/11. I think we were poised right before 9/11 to do a lot of things that were proactive in favor of reforming immigration. And once 9/11 happened, all the fears, all the xenophobia, all that stuff kicked in, and it's a political mess to try to do anything that would be proactive in terms of affecting immigration reform. And so it's an uphill battle.
Right. Could you all just sort of touch on, Father, you mentioned something about the bishop's perspective, some things that they were recommending for reform, but we haven't really talked about what's being talked about in some of the bills specifically. Mark, do you want to talk?
Okay. For once, I'm silent. I think on the legal end of things, some of the proposals that we see, some are incredibly progressive, but I don't know if you ever remember in 2006, there was a proposal in Congress to make every undocumented person an aggravated felon. And we saw demonstrations in the 1 to 2 and 3 million in the streets. And you think about that, how myopic could have they been? When we have 12 million people that do not have documentation, and you're going to call an entire generation of people a felon just by virtue of who they are, that gets very close, I think, to an authoritarian state at that point. Because then at that point, if in fact you have 12 million felons, law enforcement is commanded to follow that law, and I think in order to remove 12 million felons, there's some major social instability. And for even people that don't necessarily support immigration reform, my question to them is, what's your proposal? We talk about the demographics. We're talking 30 to 40 million probably, within the next 20 to 30 years. Does that sound about right, Mark? What's your proposal? If your goal is social stability, I think at some point you're going to have to address the situation. If not, I think you're going to see people in the streets. And as I said, legality is ultimately a function of power. I think people will take to the streets, and I think that is going to be how they're going to propose it. But I think let's try to avoid that and do the legislative process and do things like the DREAM Act, which make a ton of sense to me.
In addition to the DREAM Act, what are some of the other things that have been talked about and might be more likely to actually pass if there's an immigration reform bill in the next year?
Well, basically something that will provide a path to citizenship, that people would have record of tax paying through either an INS number, because people are paying taxes. They're paying into the system, but they're not able to access the system. The other thing is, to do some verification as to exactly who is in the country, so that there would be background checks to make sure that we know who is here, and so that it would be to eliminate this double tier that we have currently in existence in the country, where those who are legal have one system and those who are not here legally have a different system. So that's a great equalizer. Also to unify families. That's the other thing that we're trying to do in terms of advocacy for immigrants. Also, the due process and you had an interesting story about people being apprehended in our country, handcuffed, and not have any access to their family or to legal counsel. And you think, well, wow, what happened in Germany? And that's scary, but it can happen here, and it does happen here in our own country, which is really a scary proposition. But anyway, I don't know if you want to say any more.
Well, as I said, I think most of you would be sort of surprised, sort of here in the trenches of due process. A lot of the legal shows are, they're really exciting, and you see this sort of one version of the law. And I think when you actually see what's actually happening, it's aggressive and it's intense. And when you look into the eyes of some of the law enforcement that I go up against, some are very progressive, and it's just, but others you can just sort of sense this sort of qualitative disdain. I recently negotiated a very favorable resolution for a client of mine, but the condition is she had to give up her right to a detention hearing in order to get the deal. So I don't know why that would be relevant to getting the deal, but apparently they thought they were going to flee. So it's surprising once you actually see how aggressive the government is, whether your positions might change a little bit.
That's the other thing. One of the components for immigration reform would be that it would not be solely focused on enforcement, but rather that it would be more broader based than just simply enforcement.
Yeah, I think fundamentally you understand that any of these proposals, we're dealing with two horizons here. There's a horizon out here about how we make this work, and we take care of our problems and understand the contributions that immigrants make to our long-term social and economic well-being. But the short-term horizon is political, and this is very difficult. And so much of our political discussion is being driven by this very loud rhetoric. This is what's happening now in the wake of the healthcare discussion, and what will probably unfortunately happen with immigration. We'll see the debate about immigration over the summer. And as Iowa grows older, that tends to, and white Iowans, forgive me, in no respect, I'm very close to being an old white Iowan myself.
Never.
Thank you. They vote at much higher percentages than other folks. And so you've got two horizons here. And the difficulty is reconciling those two horizons. And it is difficult. Nobody is going to fool themselves about how difficult it is.
Since you mentioned old white Iowans, I thought it might be interesting to let people know who are running our nursing homes, who are the new hires in the home visiting nurse services, who are really keeping the hospitals together. It's all these new Iowans. And when you talk about the languages, when I answer the phone from the nursing home, is this woman calling from Africa? Is she calling from Thailand? Is she calling from the Philippines? We have so many new Iowans in the healthcare field and the healthcare support field. It's really phenomenal.
30% of all practicing physicians in Iowa are from another country. It's almost a third.
There's several different components to that. As I said, I'm primarily a criminal law specialist, but my partner Dan Vondra is an immigration law specialist. It has to do with something called a priority date. If you're married to a United States citizen, you can do a consular processing, and that's usually relatively quick. So we have some undocumented people, they marry a United States citizen, they actually have to go to all places, Ciudad Juarez, to do the processing. That's another story. But there it's about 9 to 12 months, and it sort of makes sense. But there's then different categories of you're petitioning for your uncle, or you're petitioning for your nephew. You're a lawful permanent resident petitioning for your spouse. And these priority dates are just laughable. And a priority date means the date upon which you can petition to obtain status. And in some cases, it's something on the order of, for certain priority dates, it's like 15 years. Well, that's just not reality. Wake up here, people. No, I don't even understand half of it. And I've done primarily criminal law, but more immigration law about the last 3 to 4 years. And I still will not answer one question without consulting my partner first. So it's incredibly complicated. And then also related to, there's the push factor. The reality is that between following our laws and feeding the family, it's a relatively simple equation. And I think it's a moral imperative, and I think it's just one of those things that, you know, as a historian, I'm sure that you're keeping the history, but I think so many of us have forgotten our own stories. And we are only about, most of us, 2 to 3 generations away from having no indoor plumbing, and not just, you know, not having your latest TV, but I mean palpable hunger. I mean, if any of you have any Irish background, that's only 150 years ago, a mass famine in Europe. So I think that's the reality, and the level of social stability there, they virtually have no choice. But I think you bring up a really good comment, and I think it is good for people to get those issues out, because I think, as Professor Gray talked about, none of us want to be considered a racist, and none of us want to make a comment where we're going to get that stare back. So if anyone, I can't believe no one else has any different point of view, and now's the time to sort of press that.
On the historical point, I mean, what's really striking about much of what we've been talking about is the reasons that people come are substantially the same across, you know, the last century. The patterns of their economic life once they get here, and is relying on small sort of entrepreneurial forms of business because of barriers to owning property or joint venture use, that sort of thing, are very similar. The sort of economic impact is very similar. What has changed over that period is the system of documentation. It is much more rigorous now. I mean, passports are only 60 years old in this country. Mm-hmm. And so, in the first wave of immigration, which is, you know, sort of largely characterized as a sort of legal period of immigration, what made it legal was the fact that there was not the same rigorous form of documentation as there is now. It was not because people were coming for different reasons and in different patterns. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I just think it's important to say one more thing about your question. I'm sorry. Just because the priority dates that Rockne mentioned are for those that have a relative, an immediate relative, who is a U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident that can petition for you. I am sure that the majority of the supposedly 12 million undocumented people here in the United States, they don't have that person. They don't have a spouse. Like, it's only a spouse, a child over 21, or a parent of a minor child. So that's it. You can't petition for an uncle. You can't petition for a second cousin. Like, I mean, that's this whole black market of like green card marriages and whatnot. It's because, like, the best response I've heard to your question, which is a very common question, is there is no line. If there was a line, people would be in it. Believe me, these people that are here working 12, 15 years, like the people I know, like God, they wish they could have been in a line. They don't want to be wasting 12, 15 years of their life. They're 30 years old. You know, they want to be married and have a family. And like all this work that they're putting in, they're getting no Social Security benefit, obviously, because they're undocumented. Taxes are coming out of their paychecks. But yeah, I mean, obviously, like everybody here said, anecdotally is the best way to meet somebody and to get to know them and to really understand, like, if they could be here legally, they would, you know? And some of the best people I know, the woman who cleans this room for the students every day, she's an amazing woman, and she was lucky enough. I know the 86 amnesty was not something that especially politicians now are very positive about, but I think it can be done right, obviously legalization, but with obviously reforming the whole system so that doesn't happen. But thanks for your question.
My question is kind of directed towards Mr. Full. We were talking together that you were saying that, you know, some of these undocumented workers were justified in breaking the law, which I think is pretty slippery slope as a phrase. But also that, you know, these people in black helicopters and black shirts were the bad guys for enforcing it. Yeah. I'm about to ask myself, what's the point in having laws if you don't enforce them?
Again, a very not a racist question. That's the thing that automatically.
No, and I think it's completely valid. That's a completely valid notion here. But you know, one of the sources I rely on is Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, and he talks about laws that are just on their face. You know, it makes sense to get a permit to have a parade because we can't all just sort of walk in the streets when we want to, but unjust in their application. And I think that, you know, identity theft, I have to admit, there are times where clients, there is someone's identity that's used, that is used. But I think the way that it's enforced, and when it affects disproportionately one ethnic group, and I think in terms of lawbreakers, we always talk about how we worship the law abider. And we somehow equate that with morality. But we forget our country was founded not upon law followers, but based upon lawbreakers. And I find the irony with the Tea Party group is that essentially it was an act of civil disobedience to commit treason against the crown. And I think there's a number of different examples in history, whether it's Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, where in fact they were justified in resisting these unjust laws. And I think with the black helicopters, that was unnecessary and it was unjust and it was wrong. And one of the reasons why my personal hero's sister, Mary McCauley, stopped it in its tracks, and they won't do it anymore. She stopped it because she knew, and everyone else, I think, implicitly knew that it was unjust. And they all acknowledge, well, not all of them, but a lot of them will not do that anymore. So I think it's just one of those things. It's not an easy question, but the reality is that every once in a while you get sort of a collective psychosis, and I think that's what we have with immigration. And Operation Endgame, for example, that was a policy identified in 2003 where the goal of the administration was to remove every undocumented immigrant within 10 years. In order to do that, you have to have a quasi-military state. And as I said, as a factual matter, what we witnessed in the last 2 years, not making this up, was a black helicopter. There really was. You go to YouTube, it's there. There really was men brandishing women in machine guns. There really was, speaking of another, well, Mary McCauley did break the law because she harbored undocumented immigrants. It's a crime to harbor. So when she was in harboring the women and children that were hiding in the churches, she was breaking the law. But I think she was willing to deal with the consequences of that. We saw brandishing machine guns. We saw people held in 5-point restraints. But I think you bring up a valid point. So as I said, I don't propose to have all the answers. But again, think about these because they are hard questions, and I think it's going to be difficult solutions.
Is there any way to have immigration reform without somehow acknowledging that people that broke the law, in this case, it is okay?
Well, one of the things that in the call for immigration reform is that people pay a penalty for having entered the country without proper documentation. That's one of the things that has been advocated. But there's also this, there's catchphrases. One of the things that one of our Senator Grassley, one of his key words is no amnesty. And so like amnesty has been elevated to sacred status, which means you cannot do anything because everything that you try to do would be considered amnesty. When you have to pay a fine, that's not amnesty. But it catches the mind and the ear, and it's an easy target. You say, oh, amnesty. You're not going to. You can't give these people anything because if you forgive, then the whole system goes to heck.
And what kinds of penalties are being discussed in immigration reform?
Well, I don't know what. I'm not exactly sure how much the whole process costs, but I know lawyers' fees are.
Sorry. I would gladly go broke if. I know that there was something called 245I, and they abolished it in 2001. At that time, you could pay a $1,000 fine, and I'm quite frankly not quite sure what fine they're proposing. But in terms of amnesty, let me remind all the original Founding Fathers type people. The pardon power is an enshrined power of the executive. So the Founding Fathers recognized that at certain point, people that broke the law deserve to be pardoned. That's enshrined as an executive power, Article 2 of the Constitution. So I think in terms of establishing the legality of that, I'm on pretty firm ground, and I think, not to be too religious as a Lutheran here, but Jesus forgave people for the sins that they had committed. So it happens all the time. So this notion that it's somehow new is just, to me, demonstrably false.
What if
Amen,
we took
yeah.
all of the money that we're putting into enforcement and used it basically for foreign aid to make it more appealing for people to stay in their home countries?
I think it's a wonderful idea. We spend a hell of a lot of money in having militarized this whole issue. I mean, those black helicopters and black shirts cost, and so do the thousands of miles of border patrol. So does the wall that's going up, that's covering hundreds and hundreds of miles, and so do all of the security apparatus and all of the violation of civil rights of many people, documented and otherwise, that get pulled into all of these things. And I think, as we started the conversation talking about NAFTA, CAFTA, and farm subsidies, I mean, there's a lot of money involved in all of these processes. And if we began to re-evaluate some of our economic policies and some of our sort of police state policies and support for them, I think there's a lot of money that could be used in much better ways.
I was in a televised debate once with a guy about illegal immigration. He said, I know how to cut off illegal immigration. I said, you do? And he said, yes, you cut off the ability of legal and illegal immigrants to send money home. I said, well, yeah, you could probably do that. I mean, you could send them a law or make it illegal to do something. And they said, there's one reason why that ain't never going to happen. And that is, if you cut off all of the money that just Mexicans alone send home, you cut off at the knees the second largest part of their gross domestic product. And we are not going to allow the Mexican economy to tank, because then our economy will tank and there will be a worldwide depression for generations. So it's kind of a reverse perspective. And now, of course, I'm confronted about this all the time, wanted to figure it out. But there are a lot of political and economic forces here that have been at work for generations. And as I said earlier, a lot of these horses have left the market.
I was just hoping that China would pay off our national debt. That's what I was hoping for.
Obviously, like, the wall is a somewhat emotional issue, but I feel like sometimes it gets demonized. Like the fact that, I mean, it's irresponsible for America not to secure its borders on both sides. I mean, there's all kinds of things going south, there's all kinds of stuff coming north.
Right.
What steps are being taken, or would you recommend being taken to, I guess, legitimize border crossing? We're talking a lot about, like, civil rights abuses, in crossing the border there. Well, clearly there has to be some, like, demarcation in law and security there, right?
So what can we do with the border that would be something practical, feasible, and work better than what we have now?
Yeah.
Mark.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. As a sovereign nation, we do have the right and the responsibility to secure our borders. That's a very good question. The irony is when you go to Mexico and you ask Mexicans in particular about the wall, they say, oh, this is a very deep insult to us. But we think that the Americans should build it. And I said, I'm sorry. Even though I'm very bad Spanish, I was getting the message here. So the building the wall is an insult, but you think they should build it? Oh, absolutely. I said, why? He said, because who will build it? The biggest public works project in the history of Northern Mexico. And most importantly, let me tell you, Mark, we will know where all the holes are and where all the tunnels are, because we're going to build it. So I guess this is a silly anecdote, but the point is, no wall. You have social and economic forces at work here that are never going to ultimately be stopped by the physical presence of the wall. And I know that you all caught this last week. Boeing, the plane manufacturer of electronics, just were stripped of a multi-billion-dollar contract for a virtual fence, which was supposed to be these electronic outposts along the border. It failed so miserably that the federal Department of Homeland Security has yanked a multi-billion-dollar contract because it simply didn't work. Ultimately, if people want to come here, they will find a way to do it. I talked to some El Salvadorians, that was a year ago, I can't remember. They paid $10,000 to be transported and smuggled into Iowa. You're not going to stop people that really want to be here. They're gamblers, and they know that over the long term, this is a strategy that they employ because they look at where they come from, what they might achieve here. And the villages that I work in Michoacan, I would bring my family here, and instead of maybe making $10 a day, I can make, right now in Denison, Iowa, you can make $16 an hour cutting up animals, versus the potential for making $9 a day busting your butt planting strawberries back in Jalisco. I know what I would do. When you have nothing, something is a lot. And we're, again, as a sovereign nation, we have the right to, and the responsibility to defend our borders, but we have processes over which no border is going to ultimately have any meaningful control.
Strawberries are in Irapuato. That's the capital. Okay, sorry.
And as an environmentalist, this wall is going to be a disaster for wildlife. Animals go across there, birds, etc., and it's going to be really difficult for biodiversity. But that's another small little consideration.
But is there anything else we can't do, or should do?
Work on economics on both sides.
Well, I think we need to advocate for the political will to reform immigration. And until we have the political will to want to reform immigration, we're still going to be spending all kinds of money basically on enforcement. And it's costing us more to have a double-tiered system than to bring everybody into the play, I think.
What kind of reforms would you propose then that would still secure our borders?
What reforms could still secure the borders?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, wait.
Let me rephrase it just slightly. Say you have immigration reform, and whether it's a reform to 86, whatever it is, and now the folks, the 12 million that are here, are now have a path to citizenship.
Right.
What about the next, however many million that are going to want to come here as well?
Right, it's a fair question. One of the criticisms of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 was that was supposed to be the amnesty to end illegal immigration forever. It failed for two reasons. One, the principal reasons. One is the lack of workplace enforcement, and the second was it didn't take into account that the people who now found themselves in the United States illegally wanted to bring their families along, and then their cousins, and then you had all these other economic and social networks that kind of kicked into place. And then, of course, a lot of people leave out of this discussion is that roughly half of all the people, so-called illegal immigrants in the country, actually enter the country legally with a valid visa, and then they overstayed that visa. And by the way, the number one group among them are the Irish, by the way. Second only to the Poles are second. So what are you going to do with them? So, when you listen to the rhetoric, and you listen to how people try to beat up on immigrants and all this sort of thing, they're always going to go back to that base thing. It's like the death penalty. They're always going to find that term, as Father said, like amnesty. We can't give them amnesty. It's a hell of a lot more complicated than that. Forgive my language, but it is a much, much more complicated than that. And there are no simple solutions. There are no simple solutions. There are no single solutions. It's an extraordinarily complex thing. You have to have a combination of fair and equitable opportunities for people who want to work here. And by the way, I work with employers, and I know of employers who would like nothing better to hire more of these people. Yet we make it whenever we put people in a position where they become relatively desperate to take those jobs, then they work for lower wages, and people can take advantage of this. And then finally, there are three actors out here. You got the employers, and we try to bang up on them. We have the employees who are willing to take these crappy jobs, but the rest of us benefit as well. Every time you consume a product which is made here or abroad by somebody who's paid relatively poorly or below standard wages, we all benefit from that. The reason that food in this society is relatively inexpensive is because it's done on the back of legal and illegal labor. And don't tell me you're a vegetarian, and that's the solution. That's absolute nonsense. You have a leather belt on, you have shoes on. Don't get me started on this later.
And don't forget who are the illegal immigrants in Mexico.
Yeah.
It's all of the wealthy or the retired white folks from this country who want cheap health care. Because the Mexican health care system is quite good.
Well, and I don't presume to have all the answers on that, but I think that it is a very complicated question. But the reality is, what do you do when there's 30 million people? I mean, there has to be something. And I think, like with the healthcare debate, one of the things I don't understand is, okay, you don't want to allow access to 23 million people. What do you do with them? Are they supposed to die? It's a hard question. I think we should struggle with it. confront your emotions, but I think the reality is something has to be done, or else it's going to get 10 times worse, and I think that's just the reality of it.
I'm not as rosy in terms of the future for this whole immigration debate, because I think that the healthcare debate is going to look like a cakewalk as opposed to immigration, because when you throw in the race and the language factor, whew, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
I agree. It's going to get rather.
It's going to get worse.
One more question. Yes.
Well, I just wanted to note that the proposals right now, everything reform, like Juarez work in the House, does mention border enforcement. It talks about enforcement. So it's not an either or. It really is a complicated approach. And that's what's before at least the House of Representatives at this point.
Correct.
And so read some of those things, because there's really some brilliant approaches to how can we make this a situation where we can build an inclusive nation and a stronger economy, and then also the longer term challenges around social and economic justice on both sides of the border.
Right.
It's out there.
Correct. Representative Luis Gutierrez from Illinois cut a deal with President Obama because the Hispanic caucus in Congress was actually very reluctant to come on board with the health bill, and basically President Obama had to cut a deal with him. Yes, the deal is if you support my health care bill, then we'll get to immigration. That was the deal, and so far he's kept his word, and we'll see. But I agree with you, Father, and I think it's going to be a mess. We ain't seen nothing yet.
And the comment was that there is border control in most of the bills.
Yes, there is.
One of the main things is border protection. So if you take that there will be any way that has to be given to out of status immigrants, like John McCue in 2008 proposed 50,000 Irish immigrants, and Polish. There's very large communities even of people that aren't crossing borders.
Correct. Yeah, roughly half of the illegal immigrants in the country are people without a status. Roughly half. And I want you all to notice that it was last week, it was right the day before St. Patrick's Day, the Prime Minister of Ireland was in Washington, D.C., met with President Obama, and the second thing on his agenda was immigration reform so that all of his countrymen who are living in the United States illegally won't get in jail or be booted out.
But that's the thing, they're just nice white folk, and they pass. They might have a nice Irish brogue or whatever. If you ever fly into Chicago O'Hare, you can walk in and you go, well, what country am I in? Because the people at customs speak in Polish. I'm going, hey. And just one other thing, I was in Germany this past week. We flew into Munich, and I turned to this gal who was from Columbia, a student, and I said, hey, did we fly into Germany or are we in Turkey? Because there are so many Turkish immigrants in Germany now that the complexion of Germany has changed. But anyway, that's another thing.
Yeah, and I think it's fair debate. What will happen, you heard it here first, is that as the rhetoric gets cranked up, we really have a genuine debate about immigration reform in this country. What will happen, the Father is right, is that when people see the tide turning the way that they don't want it, and that would be towards kind of a de facto amnesty or something, then they will racialize it. Then they will ramp up the kind of death panel kind of rhetoric. Mark my words, it'll happen. It'll be very ugly, and hopefully, as a society, we're going to stumble forward into a relatively more enlightened position. But the rest of us will pray.
And contact our Congress people.
And contact our Congress people. Yes. And President Obama's here tomorrow. Hold a big sign saying immigration reform.
Okay. To end. Since this is a policy class, if each of you could change one policy, what would you suggest changing? Let's start with
Gee, it's supposed to be short. I can't really point to one thing. I think just to bring more humanity to the process. I think that would be the big thing, and that's a very vague answer. But I think the reality is a really humanitarian impulse is just something you can sense once you see it. So. How's that for a very specific response?
I'll be about as specific. I think one of the things would be just in terms of how we enforce it. Instead of treating it as though these people committed murder, and so we're sending in people with machine guns to round them up. basically they're breaking a law because we've said it's a law. It's not in some sort of moral imperative that you don't cross borders, and treat it like that. I mean, it's much more like driving without a license and registration on your car than it is, committing theft or something that just intrinsically is wrong. And I think to start treating it that way and to say that, slapping someone with a $5,000 fine
And deporting.
to, with the amnesty that people talk about, there's those fines associated with them, to think about it in terms of that, it's more of a regulatory issue than it is some sort of, criminal, deeply held criminal issue. And I think to change that mindset would be important.
I would say pay a fine, do your duty, show you're a good contributor to society, and pay taxes like the rest of us, and let's get legalized.
I was going to go on about healthcare, but to simplify things, I think in general health is a human right, life is a human right, and that dignity for all should underpin all of our legal structure, and that if we began to think in terms of human rights and dignity, social justice, some of the solutions would actually appear to us.
I think what you do is the way that our non-system works now, is that not only do the people who are arrested and the people employed them face a great deal of indignation, but also a lot of the people on the enforcement side know darn well that the system is unjust. And a lot of them, you might be surprised, these are not all just horrible people who like to bust down doors. A lot of people on the other side of the situation are actually very decent human beings, but we're all stuck in this very bad system. And it starts with a de facto amnesty. It starts with, or at least a path towards regularizing your status, even if it doesn't necessarily end up with citizenship. I know a lot of Mexicans who don't really want to be citizens, but they just want to be here legally. And they want, and then ultimately go home, maybe retire there and so forth. And you give people those opportunities. And then I know lots of other people who just want to go back and forth. A lot of employers want them to go back and forth. And you provide opportunities for that, for a de facto guest worker program. Those have had problems in the past, and I respect that. But I think what you do is you come up with a series of opportunities for both the employees and the employers to meet those demands. Right now, the way our immigration system is set up, it's really based on labor market assumptions that are probably 30 years old. And this is just not the way that the world works anymore.
Please join me in thanking